The Sumerian civilization invented writing, the wheel, and the concept of the city almost overnight in the archaeological record. This sudden blaze of sophistication over 6,000 years ago has never been fully explained by conventional history. We are taught their gods were mere stories, personifications of nature crafted by primitive minds. This view frames mythology as humanity's first attempt to explain a world it could not yet understand through science. But a provocative and persistent theory insists we have misread the evidence. It claims the Sumerians were not just imagining their gods, they were documenting their masters. This theory turns our understanding of human origins on its head. It proposes that the Annunaki, the central gods of the Sumerian Pantheon, were not divine spirits but physical beings of advanced capability. Their direct intervention, it is argued, is the missing catalyst for humanity's abrupt leap from hunter-gatherers to builders of civilization. This documentary is a forensic examination of that claim. We will scrutinize the ancient clay tablets, weigh the arguments of linguists and archaeologists, and follow the theory's path into modern culture. We are separating myth from potential history to answer one profound question: who or what were the Annunaki? Before we continue, make sure to smash both the like and hype buttons and subscribe to our channel for more ominous history videos. We greatly appreciate your support. 4000 BC Sumer Cradle of Gods and Civilization. Picture a wide, flat plain framed by two powerful rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates. This is Mesopotamia, the land between the rivers, where soil could be both a gift and a threat. Water made harvests possible, but it also demanded canals, dikes, and constant organization to survive the seasons. Around the year 4000 BC, something extraordinary emerged in this landscape. From reed huts and small settlements rose the Sumerians, builders of true cities, creators of complex administration, and pioneers of urban life. In the archaeological record, their world seems to bloom with surprising speed and confidence. They developed the wheel for practical work, first in pottery and transport and later in warfare and trade. They created cuneiform, pressing wedge-shaped marks into wet clay with reed styluses, turning speech into durable record. They formed early law codes, managed labor, tracked goods, and built civic systems that demanded planning and discipline. This looks less like a slow drift and more like a sudden leap into advanced social organization. The question has haunted historians for centuries. Why here, and why then? Was it irrigation, trade pressure, population growth, or a rare convergence of ideas? Or did Sumer accelerate because it received an unusual spark? The Sumerians themselves offered a direct answer that shaped everything they did. They believed civilization was granted by the gods, and the gods expected repayment through temples, offerings, and obedience. They built ziggurats as divine residences, not royal tombs, and rulers thanked the gods for plans, laws, and legitimacy. To understand the Annunaki, we first enter this world where innovation and devotion were inseparable. 3000 BC, who were the Anunnaki Sumerian Pantheon, explained. So who were the beings the Sumerians honored with such intense devotion and careful record-keeping? The word Anunnaki is our first clue, a term often translated as those of royal blood or princely offspring. Even the translation suggests status and lineage, not abstract forces. The Anunnaki were not a single creator deity like later monotheistic traditions. They were a collective, a divine assembly, a group of major gods who held authority over the cosmos. They functioned less like a lone throne and more like a council, one that governed reality through decisions and decrees. In Sumerian thought, these gods were descendants of primordial powers, tied to the sky father An, also known as Anu, and the earth mother Kai. That ancestry mattered because it framed the Anunnaki as a ruling family, rather than a chaotic crowd. They were structured, ranked, and assigned domains, mirroring the organized society below them. Texts describe them gathering in assembly at sacred cities, debating outcomes and issuing decisions that fix the fates. Some traditions emphasize a powerful inner group, the seven gods who decree, whose verdicts carried ultimate weight. This is theology with bureaucracy at its core, divine authority expressed as formal procedure. They controlled the me, the divine decrees that established the fundamental patterns of civilization, including kingship, craft, truth, and social order. They governed harvests and storms, wars and treaties, and the rhythms of the heavens. To the Sumerian mind, the Annunaki were not distant poetry. They were the architects of order and the guardians of the system that made city life possible. 3000 BC, the Annunaki family tree Anu, Enlil, Enki. To navigate the Anunnaki world, it helps to begin with a triad whose relationships drive much of Mesopotamian myth. At the top sat Anu, the sky god, a distant patriarch whose name literally means sky. He was supreme in status, but often removed from daily affairs, a high authority who delegated power. Anu's word carried weight, yet the administration of the world fell largely to his sons. Chief among them was Enlil, lord of air and wind, the executive power of the Pantheon. In many stories, Enlil is the ruler who enforces decrees, grants kingship to human rulers, and maintains cosmic order through command. Enlil's center was Nippur, the spiritual heart of Sumer, where the gods were believed to gather and where legitimacy was sealed through worship. He is sometimes linked to the tablets of destiny, symbols of authority over fate itself. In these tales, Enlil is not gentle. He is decisive, strict, and sometimes severe toward humanity. Then there is Enki, a striking contrast, the god of fresh water, wisdom, magic, and creative craft. His domain was the Abzu, the sweet underground waters that nourished the land, and his personality is often clever and adaptable. Where Enlil decrees, Enki devises. Where Enlil punishes, Enki finds loopholes and solutions. This tension between the two brothers forms a central engine of myth. Enlil represents authoritative order that can become destructive when threatened, while Enki embodies inventive intelligence that often protects humanity. Their rivalry is not a simple feud. It is a balance of power, and in story after story, their choices shape the fate of human beings as surely as any storm or drought. 5000 BC Eridu, the first city and Enki's sacred home. Long before Babylon became a name associated with empire and grandeur, another city carried a more ancient claim. Eridu was remembered as the first city, the original blueprint of civilization. In later tradition, it was not simply founded by humans, it was built for a god. The Sumerians linked Eridu directly to Enki, whose watery domain made life possible in a land of canals and irrigated fields. Archaeology supports Eridu's extreme antiquity, with layers reaching back to at least 5400 BC. The deeper the excavators went, the older the story became, as if the city truly sat at the beginning. At the heart of Eridu stood a temple rebuilt again and again over centuries, each layer set upon the last. This temple was called the Abzu, the House of the Abzu, tying sacred space to Enki's subterranean waters. The architecture itself becomes a statement that the city was anchored in divine reality. Eridu was also imagined as the place where the me first descended from heaven to earth. In this worldview, civilization is not invented. It is delivered, then managed, then guarded. Enki, as keeper of the me, distributes the arts of kingship, writing, law, and agriculture outward from Eridu, like a central source feeding the other cities. Some traditions deepen the link between Eridu and the Anunnaki by assigning groups of them there, including references to 50 Anunnaki and a set of 7 who judge fates. This casts Eridu as more than a holy city. It becomes an operational headquarters, a place of cosmic administration. Even later Babylonian myths echo Eridu's primacy, preserving the memory that civilization began where sacred water met ordered rule. 3000 BC Enlil's domain, the holy city of Nippur. If Eridu was Enki's sacred workshop, then Nippur was the divine capital of authority. It was not always the political center of a dynasty, yet it remained the spiritual center of Sumer for generations. Rival cities competed in war, but they still respected Nippur's sanctity. Kings sought Enlil's blessing there to legitimize their rule. because divine approval mattered as much as armies. Offerings flowed to Nippur, even when nearby powers shifted, because the city represented a shared religious foundation. In a region of competing states, Nippur functioned like a wholly neutral ground. The city's great complex was the Ikur, the mountain house, dwelling of Enlil and his wife Ninlil. The name itself is meaningful because it presents a building as a mountain, a bridge between earth and cosmic realm. The temple was not merely a place to pray. It was imagined as a structural link in the universe. Sumerian texts describe the Anunnaki gathering in Nippur for assemblies, meeting in the Ikur precinct to debate and then decree destinies. Enlil presides, and the final decision is announced with the force of law. The imagery is vivid, a senate chamber of gods whose votes determine harvests, wars, and the fate of kings. Nippur's priesthood and scribal schools became power centers in their own right, copying texts and shaping theological memory. To disrespect Nippur was to offend the entire Pantheon, not just one city's patron. In the balance of powers, Enki's creative intelligence in Eridu is mirrored by Enlil's executive authority in Nippur. Together, they define how the Anunnaki govern, through gifts and decrees, invention and enforcement. 2000 BC Inanna, the Venus goddess who defied the Underworld. The Anunnaki were not only elder male gods issuing decrees from distant temples. The pantheon included fierce and complicated deities like Inanna, goddess of love, fertility, war and political power, tied to Venus, the morning and evening star. Inanna's stories reveal the divine world as passionate, ambitious and dangerous. Her most famous myth, the descent into the underworld, begins with a decision that feels almost reckless. Inanna chooses to enter the realm of her sister Erich, queen of the dead, driven by motives that can be read as conquest, curiosity, or a hunger to extend power into the one domain that resists control. She knows the journey is perilous and prepares for failure. At the gates of the underworld, Inanna is forced to surrender her symbols of authority one by one. She passes through 7 gates, stripped of royal attire, until she stands exposed and powerless before Erich. The underworld does not negotiate. Inanna is struck down and her body is hung, and the world above begins to feel the imbalance. Her loyal servant Ninshubur goes to the gods for help, and the responses reveal the pantheon's politics. Enlil refuses, declaring Inanna chose her path and must face the consequences. Nanna, the moon god, offers no rescue either. Only Enki responds with alarm, seeing that Inanna's absence disrupts fertility and order on Earth. Enki creates 2 unusual beings and sends them with the food and water of life to revive her, but the underworld demands a substitute. Inanna returns, pursued by relentless spirits seeking repayment, and the myth culminates in judgment. When Dumuzi fails to mourn properly, Inanna allows him to be taken, and his sister Geshtinanna shares his fate. The final decree comes from the Anunnaki, the 7 who decree, assigning each half the year below, explaining the cycle of seasons. Here the Anunnaki appear as the supreme court of cosmic law. 2100 BC Gilgamesh and the Anunnaki epic of the Immortal King. The Epic of Gilgamesh stands as the oldest surviving great work of literature, preserved on clay tablets and shaped over centuries. Set in the world of Uruk, it follows Gilgamesh, a king described as partly divine, and his friendship with Enkidu, a wild man brought into civilization. At its heart is a universal fear, the terror of death. Within the story, the gods create Enkidu to restrain Gilgamesh's arrogance, but the two become brothers and pursue glory together. Their victories carry consequences because they cross lines the divine world does not tolerate. They confront monsters, challenge boundaries, and treat the gods as obstacles rather than authorities. Their actions provoke divine judgment, especially after they offend the goddess Ishtar and bring disorder to the balance between humans and gods. A council forms, and in that council the Anunnaki appear as decision-makers who fix fate with a sentence. One of the two must die, and the verdict falls on Enkidu, turning adventure into grief. Enkidu's death breaks Gilgamesh open and forces him to face mortality with raw clarity. He begins a desperate quest for immortality, seeking Utnapishtim, survivor of the Great Flood, the one human granted eternal life. Gilgamesh fails tests of endurance and loses a plant that could restore youth, learning that immortality is not the human portion. In later parts of the tradition, the underworld appears as a bleak realm where the dead exist as shades, and the Anunnaki preside as judges of this final domain. Their decrees are not daily guidance but ultimate verdict. The epic portrays the gods as distant in their authority, and humanity as trapped inside limits the divine world will not remove. Gilgamesh returns to Uruk with wisdom instead of eternal life, and the Anunnaki remain what they always were in this story, the final arbiters of fate. 1700 BC, the Atrahasis myth, how the Anunnaki created humans. We now enter one of the most pivotal narratives in Mesopotamian tradition, the creation story preserved most fully in the Akkadian Atrahasis epic from around the 17th century BC. It offers a surprisingly practical reason for why humans exist. In this myth, humanity is not created as a treasured masterpiece. It is created as a solution. In the beginning, the great gods ruled, and the lesser gods, often called the Igigi, carried the heavy work. They dug canals, managed rivers, and performed labor that sustained the divine order. For ages this arrangement held, but the burden grew unbearable, and resentment rose like floodwater behind a dam. The Igigi rebelled and surrounded Enlil's dwelling with tools and torches, forcing the divine assembly into crisis. Enlil wanted punishment, but Enki and Anu offered a more workable answer. Instead of crushing the rebels, create a new being to take the labor and restore stability without endless conflict among the gods. The task falls to Enki and the mother goddess Ninhursag, also called Ninmah, whose roles echo craft and birth. Clay is purified and mixed with the essence of a god chosen by lot, creating a being that carries a divine spark inside an earthly body. This duality is central. Humans have intellect and spirit, yet they are tied to toil and mortality. Humanity is then limited with built-in constraints to prevent uncontrolled growth, including infertility, infant loss, and celibacy roles among priestesses. The new workers take over the labor, freeing the Igigi and allowing the Anunnaki to rest. The relationship between gods and humans is set from the start as hierarchy, not romance. In this story, we exist because a divine workforce demanded relief, and clay was shaped into a substitute. 1700 BC, the Great Flood Anunnaki judgment on mankind. The Atrahasis story does not end with creation, because the solution creates a new problem. Humans multiply, spread, and fill the world with activity until their presence becomes a disturbance to the ruling gods. The text describes humanity's noise as overwhelming, a constant roar that reaches Enlil like an insult. Enlil convenes the divine assembly and proposes reduction, not out of malice alone, but out of a desire for order and silence. A series of calamities follows, including plague, drought, and famine, each designed to cut population and restore balance. Yet each time, Enki quietly intervenes, guiding Atrahasis to survive and to appease the relevant powers. Humanity recovers again and again, and the noise returns, proving that partial solutions will not satisfy Enlil's demand. Finally, the council swears an oath to unleash a great flood, a total reset meant to erase the human problem permanently. The oath binds the gods, and even Enki is trapped by it, forced to choose between obedience and compassion. Enki finds a loophole by speaking to a reed wall instead of directly to a human, knowing Atrahasis will hear. He instructs the building of a large boat, the gathering of family and animals, and the preparation for the storm to come. When the flood arrives, the destruction becomes so severe that even the gods recoil from what they authorized. The goddess Ishtar laments, and the gods miss the offerings humans once provided, crowding like desperate beings around the scent of sacrifice when the waters finally recede. Enlil is enraged to find survivors, But Enki argues the punishment was excessive and proposes long-term population controls instead of annihilation. The Anunnaki agree, revealing a council capable of wrath, regret, and revision. The flood becomes a template that echoes far beyond Mesopotamia, reshaping later traditions for millennia. 2000 BC Babylonian Anunnaki, from heaven to the underworld. As Mesopotamia changed, its gods changed with it, not erased, but reshaped by new political centers. Sumerian culture was absorbed by Akkadian and Babylonian power, and theological emphasis shifted as empires rose. Old names remained, but roles could darken, narrow, or move into new domains. The Anunnaki, once tied to divine assemblies and cosmic governance, became increasingly associated with the underworld in later traditions. They appear more often as chthonic judges, administrators of death rather than patrons of city building. This is not a disappearance of authority, but a relocation of it into a more distant realm. In Babylonian versions of classic stories, the Anunnaki are explicitly named as judges who issue verdicts over the deceased. The Epic of Gilgamesh emphasizes this judicial function, reinforcing the sense that fate is finalized beyond the grave. The gods who once granted kingship now oversee the inevitable end of kings and commoners alike. In the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic, the focus shifts to Marduk's rise as supreme. The Anunnaki still assemble and participate in fixing destinies, yet their status becomes more subordinate within a centralized theology. The divine world grows more bureaucratic, with a clearer hierarchy under a single city's patron. This evolution reflects how theology follows empire. As new powers cared less about rival city patrons and more about cosmic order, justice, and the fear of death, the Anunnaki became symbols of those concerns. They were invoked in rituals dealing with unseen forces, fates, and spiritual threats, and their name gained a shadowed gravity. The same word could still mean power, but now it often meant power from below, not above. Nibiru, the 12th planet, and its 3,600-year orbit. The modern Anunnaki story takes a dramatic turn in the 20th century through the writings of Zecharia Sitchin. In his book, The 12th Planet, published in 1976, he proposed that ancient Mesopotamian texts preserve literal astronomical knowledge. His claim was not subtle. It was a complete reinterpretation of myth into cosmic history. Sitchin argued that the Sumerians knew of a massive additional planet with a long elliptical orbit, and he called it Nibiru. In his model, this world returns on a cycle of 3,600 years, a number he linked to the Sumerian unit Sar. This precise timing becomes the backbone of his entire narrative. He further suggested that Nibiru's passages through the inner solar system drove catastrophic events in Earth's deep past. In his reading, the Babylonian god Marduk becomes tied to this planet, and myths describing cosmic battles become descriptions of planetary interactions. The story shifts from temple courts to celestial mechanics. Sitchin interpreted the Enuma Elish as an allegory for collision, where Nibiru struck a planet he identified as Tiamat, producing debris that formed the asteroid belt and shaping Earth's orbit. This is the moment where ancient religion becomes a kind of astronomy in disguise. The gods are no longer personified forces. They are actors in a physical drama of worlds. From there he makes the leap that defines his influence, that Nibiru is inhabited by an advanced humanoid species, the true identity behind the Anunnaki. Their periodic presence on Earth matches their orbital schedule, explaining why they come and go. Whether accepted or rejected, this idea is the cornerstone of the ancient astronaut version of the legend, the hinge on which everything else swings. Ancient astronaut theory. To understand Sitchin's impact, we have to see the cultural stage that existed before he arrived. The ancient astronaut idea was already gaining traction, and the most influential spark came from Swiss author Erich von Däniken. In 1968, he published Chariots of the Gods, and a question went global. Von Däniken argued that archaeological wonders and mythic accounts might point to extraterrestrial contact. He surveyed pyramids, massive stone monuments, strange carvings, and global legends of sky beings suggesting that ancient people mistook visitors and technology for gods and miracles. His method was broad and cinematic, designed to provoke awe. The book sold millions and spilled into documentaries and television, creating a public appetite for alternative history. Mainstream scholars rejected his approach as speculative and misleading, but the cultural effect was undeniable. He reframed ancient mysteries as clues in a hidden story rather than puzzles with human solutions. Sitchin entered this atmosphere offering something more focused and, to many readers, more convincing. Instead of a worldwide tour, he centered on Mesopotamia, the land of the earliest writing, and he presented himself as a translator. Where von Däniken offered pattern recognition, Sitchin offered what looked like source material. Together, these figures shaped a powerful genre. Ancient astronaut theory became a framework, and Sitchin supplied a detailed plot with names, chronology, and motives. Even for people who never read cuneiform scholarship, the idea felt anchored because it seemed rooted in texts. That combination of mystery, antiquity, and apparent documentation is why the Annunaki story exploded far beyond museums and into modern imagination. The Annunaki mission ancient gold miners from Space Sitchin's narrative moves from cosmic orbits to a startling earthly motive, resource extraction. In his interpretation, the Annunaki did not come to enlighten humanity or guide spiritual evolution. They came for a material goal, mining, driven by a crisis on their homeworld. He claimed that Nibiru's atmosphere was deteriorating and that their scientists proposed dispersing gold particles in the sky to stabilize conditions. Gold becomes not jewelry but technology, a planetary repair tool. In this storyline, Earth is not sacred ground. It is a supply site, valuable because it holds what Nibiru needs. Sitchin places the arrival of the first landing party around 450,000 years ago, describing a group of 50 Anunnaki establishing a base near the Persian Gulf. He links this to traditions that associate Eridu with a set number of great gods, turning mythic numbers into logistical details. Enki becomes the expedition leader, framed as chief engineer and scientist. The work, in this account, shifts to mining operations, often placed in southern Africa in Sitchin's retelling, where he points to ancient mines as support. The labor is harsh, and the narrative echoes Mesopotamian myths of divine workers growing resentful. The rebellion of the Igigi becomes, in his reading, a historical labor crisis among extraterrestrial miners. That rebellion forces a solution that aligns neatly with the Atrahasis creation story, the creation of a new worker species. Sitchin recasts myth into corporate problem-solving, with humans as the manufactured labor force designed to replace unwilling Anunnaki workers. This motive is crucial because it gives the theory an economic engine, a reason for repeated visits and long-term involvement. In this frame, humanity begins as a tool in an alien industrial project, not the climax of evolution. How the Anunnaki created Homo sapiens. The climax of Sitchin's interpretation is the origin of Homo sapiens, which he claims was not natural evolution, but engineered design. Following the supposed minor rebellion, the Anunnaki leadership convenes a council, and Enki proposes a radical plan. Combine their own genetic material with that of Earth's hominids to create a capable but controllable worker. Sitchin identifies the Earth-based creature as Homo erectus and reads Mesopotamian creation language as technical metaphor. Clay becomes a stand-in for biological material, and the mixing of divine essence becomes the combining of genetic code. A chosen god, Ilu, represents the Anunnaki contribution, the donor element that gives humans intelligence beyond the animals. Enki and Ninhursag become chief geneticists in this retelling, the engineers of a new species. Sitchin points to symbolic motifs, such as the so-called Tree of Life and other artistic patterns as hints of biological knowledge. He argues that the myths preserve memory of laboratory procedures, not temple poetry. He also leans on a perceived sudden emergence of modern humans in the fossil record, emphasizing the appearance of advanced cognition and symbolic behavior. In his view, this looks like an upgrade rather than a gradual transition. The first successful human is named Adamu, linked to Adam, and the early prototypes are described as having limitations that were later corrected. The story then becomes a drama within the divine family, with Enlil wanting humans as tools, and Enki granting them the ability to reproduce, creating a self-sustaining workforce. That secret gift becomes the dividing line between harsh authority and protective cunning. Whether accepted or rejected, this reinterpretation is compelling to believers because it explains human uniqueness as inheritance from a superior species. In this frame, consciousness is not merely evolution. It is the echo of Anunnaki design. The Nephilim connection Annunaki as biblical giants Sitchin expands his narrative beyond Mesopotamia by linking it to the Hebrew Bible, creating a combined mythology that spans cultures. His key bridge is the cryptic passage in Genesis describing the sons of God taking the daughters of humans as wives. Their offspring are called the Nephilim, described as heroes of old and men of renown. The word Nephilim is often translated as giants or fallen ones, and mainstream scholarship debates what the passage preserves, perhaps a fragment of older beliefs about divine beings. Sitchin offers a decisive interpretation. The sons of God, he claims, were Anunnaki, not spiritual angels, but physical extraterrestrials. In his storyline, the intermingling occurs after humans are created, as certain groups of Anunnaki or their worker class begin to mate with human populations. The offspring are hybrids, stronger and larger, and these become the Nephilim. This adds a dramatic layer, suggesting humanity's early history included a separate caste of mixed ancestry. This link also allows him to fuse flood narratives, arguing that the spread of hybridization contributed to the decision to reset humanity through the deluge. Enlil's desire for control becomes tied to genetic purity, while Enki's protective actions preserve a line through a chosen survivor. The Mesopotamian boat story and the biblical ark become two tellings of one hidden event. Sitchin then extends the idea into later biblical references to giant clans like the Anakim and Rephaim, presenting them as lingering hybrid bloodlines. This move is powerful because it embeds the Anunnaki narrative inside the most influential religious text in the Western world. For many readers, it makes ancient astronauts feel closer, as if the Bible itself contains a coded history of contact. Whether seen as insight or overreach, it turns a strange biblical line into a central pillar of an expanded Anunnaki saga. Sumerian artifacts evidence of advanced technology. Ancient astronaut proponents often point to physical objects and ask whether certain artifacts suggest knowledge that seems out of place. They argue that if the Anunnaki were real visitors, traces might survive not only in stories but in technology. This approach turns museums into crime scenes, where every odd object becomes potential evidence. A frequent example is the so-called Baghdad Battery, a clay jar from around 250 AD with a copper cylinder and iron rod. When filled with acidic liquid, reconstructions can produce a small electric charge. Mainstream interpretations range from practical craft use, such as electroplating, to ritual or medicinal purpose, but the artifact remains intriguing because it resembles a device. Other claims reach beyond Mesopotamia, such as Egyptian reliefs that some call the Dendera lights, interpreted by believers as depictions of bulbs and filaments. Egyptologists see symbolic images, cosmic snakes, lotus flowers, and mythic language expressed in art. The dispute shows the core problem, whether we are reading images literally or through the culture's intended symbolism. Mesopotamian reliefs add their own ambiguous icons, including winged figures holding a bucket and a pinecone-shaped object. Some theorists interpret these as tools, devices, or symbols of altered consciousness, while scholars generally identify them as ritual instruments tied to purification and fertility. Similar debate surrounds the so-called handbag motif, seen in different cultures, which believers frame as a portable technology and scholars treat as conventional ceremonial imagery. Artifacts like the Waka vase, dated to around 3200 BC, show layered scenes of water, plants, animals, and humans presenting offerings to Inanna. To archaeologists, it is a masterful religious narrative of order and abundance. To some theorists, it hints at stage creation or engineered hierarchy. The hard truth is that artifacts rarely speak without interpretation, and interpretation is where certainty fades. These objects keep the debate alive because they are concrete, ancient, and just mysterious enough to invite both careful scholarship and speculative wonder. Cuneiform tablets. The translation wars. The battle over the Annunaki is ultimately a battle over words, because the ancient astronaut theory depends on reading ancient texts in a specific way. Cuneiform is not an easy script, and Sumerian is not an easy language. Every wedge-shaped mark must be placed in context, and context is where meaning lives or dies. The decipherment of cuneiform began in earnest in the 1850s, with scholars such as Henry Rawlinson, who worked from monumental inscriptions like the Behistun inscription. Over time, researchers built grammars and dictionaries of Akkadian and later Sumerian, creating the academic foundation known today as Assyriology. It is slow scholarship built on comparison, repetition, and caution. Trained Assyriologists spend years learning the scripts, sign values, and the habits of ancient scribes, because the same sign can carry multiple meanings. It is not simply translation, it is reconstruction of a world. Into this field, Sitchin entered as an outsider who studied languages independently and claimed radical new readings. Mainstream scholars argue his translations are unsound, saying he selects rare meanings, pulls words out of literary context, and treats poetic myth as literal report. They point to examples where he reads common words in unusual ways to support spacecraft and space travel. Scholars counter that the corpus does not permit these readings when sign values and grammar are applied consistently. Supporters respond that academic institutions can become protective and dismissive, unwilling to entertain disruptive interpretations. They argue that outsiders sometimes see what insiders ignore, and they present Sitchin as a challenger to an entrenched gatekeeping system. This standoff produces two incompatible Annunaki, gods within a religious tradition, or visitors within a hidden history. Which version feels real depends on which translation authority you trust, and trust is the rarest resource in this debate. Why scholars dismiss Sitchin? Academic response to Sitchin has been overwhelmingly negative, and the reasons are consistent across disciplines. Scholars argue the problem is not that his ideas are bold, but that they fail basic methodological tests. In academic work, extraordinary claims require evidence that holds up under scrutiny, not just narrative power. The first critique returns to translation, the foundation on which everything else rests. Specialists argue that Sitchin often assigns meanings that are not supported by grammar or by the broader usage of terms across thousands of texts. They claim he treats dictionaries like menus, choosing the meaning that fits his story even when the context points elsewhere. Astronomy is another major objection because a large planet with a 3,600-year orbit entering the inner solar system would leave detectable gravitational fingerprints. Scholars note that such an orbit would be unstable and would affect the motions of known planets. They argue there is no observational support for the specific Nibiru model Sitchin describes, making the astronomical pillar collapse. Historians also criticize the anachronistic feel of the narrative, saying it projects modern concepts like industrial mining corporations, advanced space travel, and laboratory genetics onto cultures that explain the world through divine will and ritual order. Myths, they argue, are not engineering logs. They are cultural texts shaped by metaphor, politics, fear, and hope, written in the language of religion. Archaeologists point out that Sumerian society shows gradual development through layers of excavation, with innovation, exchange, and local problem-solving visible over time. They argue that attributing Sumer's achievements to outsiders erases human ingenuity and misunderstands how complex societies form. To scholars, Sitchin's work reads like science fiction built from selective facts and misunderstood texts. The dismissal is not simply resistance to new ideas, it is a claim that the evidence does not support the story. Gods, aliens, or human imagination? We have traveled across thousands of years of myth, history, and modern speculation, beginning in the riverlands where the first cities rose and the first writing hardened in clay. We stood in Eridu and Nippur as ideas, not as ruins, and listened to a civilization explain its own greatness through divine patrons. For the Sumerians, the Annunaki were not optional, they were the frame of reality. We then followed those gods through later transformations as Mesopotamian empires rose and reinterpreted the old powers. The Annunaki shifted from cosmic administrators to darker judges of the underworld, presiding over fate and the dead. Myths like Inanna's descent and the Epic of Gilgamesh revealed a divine world that was political, legalistic, and uncompromising. Next, we entered the modern storm, where Zecharia Sitchin recast the Anunnaki as extraterrestrials from Nibiru, driven by resource need and capable of genetic engineering. We traced how ancient astronaut theory prepared the public imagination, how biblical connections widened the narrative, and how artifacts became battlegrounds for interpretation. In that version, the story is not theology. It is hidden history. We also confronted the strongest skeptical case that translations do not support Sitchin's claims, and that the astronomical and methodological problems are too severe to ignore. Scholars argue the Sumerians were brilliant on their own, that their innovations have visible developmental roots, and that myth is not a technical manual. The debate is not just about aliens, it is about what counts as evidence and how we respect the past. So where does that leave us? One path sees the Anunnaki as a magnificent creation of human imagination, a symbolic language that helped the first civilization explain nature, law, and power. Another path sees them as a cryptic record of literal events that we are not yet equipped to decode. Perhaps the most durable truth is that the Anunnaki have become immortal in a different way, surviving not in flesh or orbit but in story. From clay tablets to modern screens, they continue to pull us toward the same question that haunted the first scribes. Who are we, and did something reach down into our beginning? If you made it this far, thanks for watching, and make sure to smash both the like and hype buttons and subscribe to our channel for more ominous history videos. We greatly appreciate your support. See you in the next video.